Alright, so now I'm recording. Hopefully now I'm going out live. Just kind of looking in. Like I said, everything fine here? Okay, so that's the problem with going live through the computer, is that sometimes the video that shows kind of freezes. So we'll just go ahead and, I got the little green light, so hopefully things are going well. Yeah, gotta love technology. But anyway, so as I was saying, I go live every weekday. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to get there we go. Had to get my view right. Try to go live every day, 4 o'clock, and today I'm not really sure what I'm doing. Like I said, I worked over the weekend, and I found an hour on Saturday, an hour on Sunday, so I keep rolling on. I've been doing this every day for September now, so here we are, week number 14. So I'm just going to kind of dive in and kind of see what develops. I've been really kind of working intuitively, and sometimes I'll kind of look through things and kind of think about it beforehand. Other days I just sort of show up and start making it and really kind of let the intuition kind of flow. So hopefully you've got some materials and you're going to kind of make alongside me, and that's kind of awesome if you do. Excuse me. So let's go ahead and get started. So anyway, I've got my paper, I've got my paints. I've kind of cleared off my space a little bit, but I'm sure it'll get kind of messy. So yeah, I don't know what I'm going to be working with, but I just kind of looked up here and I kind of felt like this orange was calling my name. So I'll just go ahead and put some of this orange. Now it's a little bit bright, so I'm going to dip my brush in the water I don't want my colors to be too strong right now. Because when I'm really thinking about like more of a background, I want it to be a little bit on the lighter side. And as always, I'm working on mixed media paper. It's nice. It can handle the wide variety of materials that I work with. I can scrub really well and really hard, and it's not gonna kind of come apart. Sometimes that's an issue. It's called pilling, when you start to see little dark dots it looks like paint, but it's actually the paper coming up. So alright, so I got my first layer. Go ahead and hit it with the hair dryer. Alright, so I got some paint on there. Go ahead and I'm going to grab a pen. I think I'll go ahead and do some ink now. Sometimes I build up several layers of the watercolor and watercolor pencil, but I think today I'll just dive in with some ink. I've really been focusing on mapping marks, and it's something that I just keep coming back to. First of all, the lines, I'm drawing lines that are reminiscent of streets and roads. But this is just a great, easy way for me to divide up the space. But it's reminiscent. When I look at it, it's like, oh, it looks like a map. But it's not any place in particular. Sometimes I do that. Sometimes I'll use the lines of a particular place, like whether around where I live or where I grew up. But more often than not, whenever I'm drawing these lines, I'm just kind of being random about it. I think in part it's more of that compositional device. So, like I said, a way to divide up the space. But then also it's a little bit more universal. You kind of, oh, that looks like a place. Alright, so I've got a few little lines in there. Let's see, maybe grab my Inktense pencils. So I'm using a poppy red, which is a real bright, warm red. I'm just going to free draw some shapes here. If you've been tuning in, you may notice that a lot of times I'll do like three circles or three squares. And I like that number 3. It's a very stable number. If you think about a triangle actually is the most stable shape, and that's why you see a lot of bridges and things created from triangles. It's kind of a very stable, very very stable, secure shape. So that number 3, just kind of echoes that. But then I like having a shape that balances. So it's a 4th circle, but it's bigger. But it does kind of create this triangular shape with all the different circles. Maddie just commented about loving the Inktense pencils. Yeah, they are. I mean, they're my favorite water-soluble pencil. For years, I used the Prismacolor watercolor pencils, and they're a high quality, nice, bright. Actually, the Inktense and the Prismacolor work very much the same. And as far as quality, they're on par with each other. I wouldn't say one is better than the other as far as quality. The colors are both very bright. But what I like about the Inktense is because it's ink, I have the big set of 72. Every color except for white is transparent. Whereas with watercolor pencils, they get a lot of their lighter colors like pinks and light blues by mixing white into them. And I just don't like the way they layer up. So if you're trying to layer one of those lighter colors on top of other colors, it has a bit of a white to it that kind of makes the color a little bit cloudy when you're using it on top of other colors. And that's the only reason I don't use the Prismacolor watercolor pencils. I've never tried the Derwent watercolor pencils. I've just always used their Inktense. But I just like the fact that it's ink, so it's transparent, more like the watercolors that I use. So not only do I use mapping kind of marks, I have been using a lot of maps. I think one of the reasons I use a lot of the maps is that again, I love maps, but then also I think it helps. Um, it kind of I can create with it without it being very specific. It's not a face, it's not an animal, it's not a flower, it's a map. So it creates this line on here, and we can see that it's part of a map. And even if we can't tell if it's someplace specific, I think that it's okay. And one of the things I've been doing a lot with this series of artworks is using the collage elements to create lines and to kind of divide up some of the space. So just kind of creating some stripes and some lines out of it is kind of interesting to do. Oftentimes we think about lines, stripes, things like that. We think about doing that with our drawing materials, with ink, or maybe even with paint. But it's kind of interesting to do it with the collage elements. So if you're just tuning in and you want to say hi in the comments, I always appreciate seeing where people are tuning in from. You don't have to, but it's always kind of nice. So one of the things that if you've been tuning in for more than one of these, is that you may notice that I'm using a lot of the same or similar elements. So I'm using a lot of the same materials and using them in a very similar way. I'm using a lot of mapping marks, actual maps. Cutting these collage pieces into lines and into stripes. And I think for a lot of beginning artists that might seem like a little strange, like, oh, you're just kind of repeating yourself. And isn't art supposed to be, and creating supposed to be about like developing something new? And it is to some degree, but I don't think you get onto something new until you've explored something that intrigues you and you discover something about it. So for me, what happens is there's something intriguing about these materials, and I haven't discovered what it is yet. I haven't figured out why I want to use these over and over again, why I'm using certain shapes or certain materials. So that's the first thing. The other thing is that it's all about style too. A lot of beginning artists struggle with finding their style just because they haven't made enough art. And unfortunately, when we're in school and we're taking art classes, oftentimes it's like you're you have these different projects, and you're always doing something totally different, and projects don't relate one to another. You're using charcoal for one and watercolor for another and clay for another, but that's not how most artists work. Most artists say, hey, look, there's these materials and there's something fascinating about them. I really enjoy them. I've mastered them to some degree, and how can I use them to create or to tell my story, or you have to figure something out about it. And you can't do that if you're always jumping around trying a ton of new things. And unfortunately, I think a lot of art product manufacturers want us to like buy tons of new stuff, and so they're always developing these new things, and then it's like, oh, but I haven't really mastered using some of these other things. So there's something to be said about continually that's hard to say, to continue making art that's similar, that has a similar style. I think I want to maybe hit this up with a little bit of yellow, maybe heighten some of the orange, but then bring a little bit of color into those mapping pieces. Yeah, I think a lot of times we're really attracted to new materials and new ideas because they really have a promise. There's this promise of something new and exciting. But far too often I find that the new things sit in my studio and I go back to some of the more tried and true materials and techniques. And I know a lot of artists that have studios full of materials that they don't use because, like, they have this new kind of paint and it has such promise. But then when you get into your studio and you're making, sometimes those new materials kind of sometimes they can be a little intimidating too. It's kind of like, well, I haven't mastered those, but I have mastered these other ones, and so it could be a level of comfort that I'm more comfortable using these older materials, these other materials. So I'm not anti-new materials and anti-new things, but I know the allure of walking into the art store and being like, oh wow, I've got to get those. And that just really helps push that collage, that map stuff down into the piece. Just trying to think what I want to add next. I keep thinking there's a type of line that or a type of drawing that I've used a lot, not so much in these little pieces, but kind of in lots of other pieces, and I just kind of feel like I want to work some of that in. Because it ties in with mapping to some degree, and I'm thinking like right down here might be a good space. And so what I'm drawing is something I've developed over time, especially working in my visual journal. Just sitting down sometimes and doodling, and kind of just experimenting and trying some things out, and you start to create and make things, and then you're like, oh, that's really interesting. And then you kind of try to discover, like, well, why am I doing this? What about it is really interesting? And so years ago, I don't know how many, I can probably look in my journals from 10 years ago and find that I was making these marks, and they're just based off of lines and shapes. And typically I use an ink pen, and I make some thick and some thin, but I start to tie these various lines together. And I don't know exactly when I started doing them. It probably was an evolution of just some doodles, like I was saying in my journal. And but over time, what I've discovered and what I've figured out is that it's really about connecting. And a lot of the stuff that I do explores this notion of connection. And it just goes to this idea. I know I've been talking a lot about working with intuition and not really having an idea or a theme with the work, but there's, I think, always this undercurrent, this big idea, as we call it in art education. And a lot of artists do that. A lot of artists have a big idea, something that broad, that they are exploring in their work. And it's not something that's specific to a material or a medium. So it's not like, oh, well, my big idea is working with transparent materials. Well, no. My big idea is connection. And I do that with some transparent materials and building up these layers. So it's kind of like this overarching idea that comes up again and again. And it wasn't something that was always evident. And it's something that's taken years to sort of realize. And so if you're sitting there going, well, I don't really have a big idea. It's like, you don't have to. But it's something that you might want to start thinking about. Like, the big idea really is the big why, the big rationale. Like, why am I doing this work? What does this mean to me? I know some folks are kind of following along and maybe not copying me, but kind of using some of my cues and some of my techniques. And that's a great way to learn. But, thinking about your style, what are you trying to say as an artist? What's your voice? And so back to these marks that I'm making, these lines, they all just connect. They come together in odd ways, and so I kind of think about them symbolically and how we connect with other people, and how we connect differently with different people. I often pay attention to my doodles. So we often think about doodling as a very unconscious thing, and we just kind of let our hand wander. But I've found over the years that it's like these images, these ideas have come up over and over again. And I always think, like, okay, there's something about that. There's something interesting about that. What does that doodle mean? Why do I keep coming back? And thinking back to that notion of style, we can't discover our style if we don't just sit down and make a whole lot of work. We can't figure out what we're trying to say with our art unless we sit down and make a whole lot of work. So if you have any questions or comments, feel free to pop them into the comments section, and I'll try to respond or answer while we're live here. Hopefully you're all just busy working. But if you have any questions or comments, I'd be happy to respond to them. So one of the things that you may have noticed with my work is that I work up to the edge, and so whether I'm gluing on collage pieces or I'm drawing these lines, I like for them to go to the edge. And that just really makes it appear to be a smaller piece of something larger. And so there's that illusion that there's more to this little world than what is seen on the paper. So it's not a self-contained little universe on the paper. So I have all these very dark, heavy black lines on this side, and it kind of balances out this bigger space out over here, but I want to have a little bit of these lines kind of peeking in on this side too, to just help bring a little bit of balance to it. Sorry, just realized I had gone kind of silent there for quite a while. Have gotten wrapped up in using the pens, and so I was creating those black lines, and now I'm just using the red just to pull out those circles that I put in a little bit earlier. That's the thing, sometimes you just kind of get into that rhythm of making marks. I may have mentioned this before, but there's kind of this very meditative quality. I often think of it as like mindful mark making. It's just this idea that it's a simple but repetitive kind of mark making that doesn't take a lot of focus, and so your mind just sort of wanders a bit and gets kind of caught up in the physical act of making the marks. Just going to go back to some of this orange I used at first. And maybe just sort of strengthen some of the orange around. So I decided to use this orange pen, and it might not even be showing up on the video. It's very subtle on these colors, and that's exactly why I chose it. Is that I knew that it might be a good way to add some lines without it really overpowering the image. So it just sort of creates a texture that's very subtle. So sometimes when I get to this point, it's kind of thinking about how can I add things that aren't going to drastically change the composition. Alright, well I'm having a feeling like this one is done, so I think I'm going to call it done and sign it. And there'll be another one in the books. Alright, so yeah, so really kind of today I was thinking about that notion of the style, and I was using a lot of the same things, the map making marks, the circles, using maybe thinking about that idea of threes and triangular compositions. But I did throw in a new element, those black lines of connection there, just to try something a little different, something a little new. So anyway, I definitely appreciate you joining in, and just to let you all know that I do have some new online workshops coming up. So if just kind of want to plug those. So I have one coming up later this month on the 26th. That's all about image transfers. And then I have a couple new ones, some journal workshops coming up in October. So one on Monday evenings and one on Wednesday evenings. So if you're inclined, you can check out my website for those. But yeah, so if you've got any questions, any comments, feel free to pop those into the comments. And if I don't have a chance to answer them now, I'll respond to them. I always try to type up some kind of response to questions and such. So Anyway, I really appreciate you tuning in today, and tomorrow, same time, 4 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time here in Virginia in the U.S. So, yeah, so thank you so much, and I'll see you tomorrow.